So, you know, for those of you who don't know, you all know me and you all know what's going on. Jeannie, I think you probably know too. So we run this program here in Los Angeles, LA Metro program. It's about 30 students and they're here since January. And of course, there's been lots of challenges along that journey that the rest of the world is managing too. And because it's a 2-quarter project, we began it in a normative manner, and then we still have the same project. So there are some things that might come up that may seem, you know, it's a very large, high density kind of housing type project. So there's some issues there, but in general, we hung in there the whole time and kept going. This is our group of students. So there's about 30 of us here in Los Angeles, and actually some have gone home. I think one's actually in Canada, Jeannie, near you. Anyway, and so we've been just working as a team. It's not just me alone. I have a lot of support, which is fantastic. We run this as a kind of a team effort. You know, I'm the director, and then Ismael Soto is out there somewhere. He's been teaching design alongside me. He's out there, maybe he's not here yet, or he's joining us later. He's actually a former Cal Poly student who went to UCLA and then went off to work for UN Studio and those kind of characters, Co-op Him and Blau. Anyway, he's with us doing a lot of the computer stuff and design. Pavel Getov, he's with us right there. Pavel, wave. Pavel, as you may know, used to work at Morphosis. He runs his own office and here in LA, Studio on Teres, I think, something like that, and does a lot of work as well. He's did a lot of the design development CD work and things like that on many of the big Morphosis projects, and so he works with our students with DD kind of work on the second half and design work on the second half of the quarter. So you'll see, I think there's some interesting work that they've been able to achieve. Teddy Slowick was here this morning. He's not here, I don't think now, but
it's an access, by the way.
What?
He wants an access. He's also a severe.
He's there out there somewhere in the attendee world trying to get in. Yeah, let's see if I can get him in here. Boom. Teddy Slowick, he teaches also at Woodbury, and he's been teaching with us at Cal Poly, and he assists within the, he's got his own practice, and he also assists on the design and practice end. Fabio Zangoli, he teaches structures. So he's also been helping our students. And then Sarah Hearne and Alex Maymind also teach history theory to our students. So it's kind of an organized team kind of project with the 30 students. We all have the same design project. We all meet in studios together. So it's kind of fun on that level. So we have 5 reviewers today, and we have 5 projects. So do we have 5? 1, 2, 3. No, we only have 4, so that's good. So Tom Day. On a wave. Tom Day is over at Morphosis office. You've been there a while now, right? Several years.
About 8 years.
Yeah, so you know, our students intern at the Morphosis office. They also have a fellowship program there with our students, and so he was one of their first people that they would meet, and he's moved on into higher echelons of that practice, but it's still great critic, great to have him around. Jeannie Kim from Toronto, you're running the undergraduate program, if I understand that correctly.
Yep, that's right.
Yep. And Jeannie and I went to Princeton together a long time ago doing PhD work. So it's great to see Jeannie coming out from Toronto and adding a new perspective. Matt Shaw is from Architect's Newspaper. Hopefully he'll show up where he's out there and I'll have to go find him. And then Geoffrey von Oeyen, I just labeled you GVO office to make it short. I don't know how you feel about that. He's an architect here in Los Angeles, does a lot of work out in Malibu, and he's a professor at USC. And Ingalill Wahlroos-Ritter, who's the dean of Woodbury, also an architect. So it's great to have her here. I think you've been with us before. And then we have our 4 students who will be presenting: Daniel, Reann, Ivan, and Inno.
Stephen, okay, just kidding. Inno is just waiting to get into the room as well.
Okay, I'll find him, make sure he gets in there. So just to give you really quickly brief so you know what our projects generally run about. You know, I always start, because they're 2 quarters long, we start with a kind of a formal assignment that deals with a little bit of primitives and different kind of geometries, kind of semi-pure geometries, and we kind of work to create an architectural form that has interiority and exteriority and kind of creates different kind of formal shapes. Everyone develops their own project, we land them into a site, and that just becomes a kind of an architectural interest that they take into the design project as we go along and they develop it. We initiate a program a few weeks into the class, and it's usually quite large. This is fourth-year students, undergraduates, BArch. And it's an urban design type project as well within Los Angeles. So our program this year is 660,000 square feet. It's a multi-income housing project with hotels, 2 hotel components, a transient hotel and a boutique hotel. And then we also have social and health services built into that as well. With we also have transitional family housing that becomes part of that. And then we have creative office spaces and retail spaces, and then also substantive public interior, exterior urban spaces of the in-between. That's kind of what the design tends to be about. So about 250,000 square feet is given over to micro units, transient hotel, boutique hotel, high to mid income housing, mid to low income housing, and transitional family housing. And then there's also commercial and public spaces, public restaurants, cafes, office space, exhibition galleries, and then the landscaped public territories, and there's parking. The site is in downtown Los Angeles. So here's downtown, here's Skid Row, this is the fashion district. We sort of sit on that edge condition between sort of this larger high-rise territory and the move towards maybe low-rise type of more industrial kind of environments. And it's on a street here right off of Main, between 8th and 9th Street. And it's pretty much a fairly empty lot. We have taken the entire lot for the student project. It has this interesting open space kind of right in front of it. And we took the general standard of a 12-story building max for the project as a whole. So, you know, gives you an idea of the lot off of Main Street between 8th and 9th, and then there's an alley that runs behind it. Generally speaking, it's a 12-story project with a 660 square foot coverage and 110-foot lot. So we have about 50% porosity. So it's guaranteed that they're going to have to manage a type of open indoor, outdoor type spaces, also with hotels and housing, usually requiring a more narrow kind of spatial feature than the lot. The lot itself is 175 by 625 and has a very strong elevational quality. So really the topic's really about those spaces of the in-between and how we design those and inhabit them in relationship to one, having an architectural concept that's form and material, having a strong urban concept that deals with site strategy, and then maybe a socio-political perspective within, usually through how you organize and program the space. So that is me, and I'm gonna end that. And we will jump to, did I not introduce you guys? I did, didn't I? Yeah. All right, so we're gonna jump to, stop sharing my screen, and Daniel, you can start taking over. We have about half an hour per person, a little bit less.
Perfect. All right. Let me get this switched over.
And so we also gave you those concept boards that you can just kind of see what the work is, and they'll present in PowerPoint.
All right, can everyone see the screen correctly?
I don't see your screen.
It's not on?
No.
Let me try it.
There you go.
Perfect, okay. Well, first of all, thank you guys all for coming to the review. I really appreciate it. My name is Daniel Weaver, and today I'm gonna present my project. Oh, excuse me, sorry, 1 second. Sorry, today I'm gonna present my project, Concentrated Decompression, to you guys. So Stephen already covered a little bit about sort of the site and what was happening there. So I guess I'll cover that pretty quickly, but essentially the site is located in the Fashion District in southern downtown Los Angeles. And it currently hosts a mix of retail and restaurant space, as well as office space and light manufacturing in the adjoining buildings behind. And so sort of the unique difficulty of the site is presented in the dimensions of the elongated block, nearly 625 feet long by 175 feet wide. In addition to the elongated site came a complex program. The building is mixed use, containing retail and restaurant space, a boutique hotel, a transient hotel, creative office space, and a range of housing units, including transitional family housing and micro units. So because the program was so complex, in order to give clear organizational strategies to the building, I played off the existing context by placing retail and restaurant on the bottom floor, and then topping that off with creative office space. And then finally, the hotel spaces populate the right side of the right side of the building towards 9th Street, with the housing units sort of merging towards the top area. And along with such a dense program came challenges of decompressing the space in order to provide moments of rest in the nearly 660,000 square feet of program. So explorations of initial formal studies of the project revealed the unique potential to erode the interior of a mass through the differencing of objects through the exterior. This erosion of the interior space not only acts as a decompression of a dense object, but results in sort of a unique inside to outside relationship with these void spaces. Following through on these formal studies, the building creates void spaces in order to serve as a programmatic and spatial decompression inside. As seen in the diagram to the upper right, the voids take advantage of skylights on the top and covered exhaust on the side to bring the cuts through the building, adding internal porosity, natural light, and fresh air. In addition, they create a great ability to transition programs across the floor plates. As we take a look at the ground floor plan, it doesn't take full advantage of the programmatic divisions using voids. So the building itself cuts back in a similar way to provide porosity on the ground level. Here you can see an array of retail and restaurant space, as well as the lobbies for all the programs above. The fourth floor plan itself shows open creative office space, as well as the boutique hotel on the southern right side of the building. However, as we move up to the sixth floor plan, the voids begin to sort of truly reveal their full potential. By cutting into the building, as you can see where my mouse is moving, the transition between the inside and outside becomes blended. The space is used to compress and decompress programs across the floor plate. So if you look on the left side, you can see the office space as a compressed program, decompressing with the void space, transitioning to transient hotel, decompressing, and then finally another transition. And this becomes apparent again in the 11th floor plan as well, which features office space on the left side, and then a modular housing unit design around the outside of the building. As we take a look at the cross section, it was really important for me to take advantage of the open space, the voids inside the building, in order to blend the vertical divides between contrasting programs and communities. So by creating spaces that hang off the side of the voids, tailored programs attached to the circulation are used to connect differing communities located on separate floors. So if you take a look at the diagrams on the left side here, you can start to see examples of this connection, or these connector spaces. So on the top is the community connector, creating a sort of a game room with a lounge or seating space, and then circulation connected to that to help connect floors such as the housing, two different housing communities that typically wouldn't interact on a daily basis. And these same connectors can act as programmatic connectors as well, with a more tailored program to that. So for example, using something such as a cafe and seating above to draw people from maybe an office space and housing units to sort of occupy the same area together. And so these spaces were very vital to the building as they create opportunities to share interactions between contrasting communities and provide opportunities to blend the dense program. Finally, as we get into a little bit more detail of the building uses a steel structural system on the left side with large, about 7-foot deep trusses spanning on the 6 floors as well as the roof to help span over top of the large voids and the porosity on the ground floor of the building. In addition to this, I created modular housing units for the building to sort of rationalize or understand the great amount of of housing units that were needed. So these spaces are based on a 60-foot by 25-foot module. And sort of each super unit, if you look at the top here, is rearrangeable and can house a maximum of 6 units depending on the spatial division. Finally, as we transition sort of to the formal moves and back to the outside, the building takes I would say, a nuanced formal approach, sort of emphasizing the internal programmatic changes of the exterior facade. And so this is really highlighted through the modular housing units. As you can see, those come through clearly in the facade. The office spaces always features as double height glazing, retail single window wall, and then punched openings on the right side for the hotel. In addition, you can see as number 5 on the elevation here, it also shows where these large sort of exhausts from the voids come out and puncture through the outside of the building, again, creating that transition space between the interior and exterior. In a way, the design sort of acts as a microcosm with the greater whole sort of being designed to represent the smaller details inside. Thank you.
I would say, Daniel, I really appreciate the way that you managed the scale. It's kind of the massing of the project. I think that is one of its strengths. I think the way that could you put your final image back up there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the way that you illustrate some of the housing units as these smaller, highly unitized elements on the facade within these kind of larger programs that are slotted together sectionally, and then the way the kind of cross section of the building reveals those mixed community amenities, I think that's quite successful. So I think that's working on the from a massing and from a spatial quality as well. I'm wondering if you have any other images that might show what that looks like on the inside of those voids and what those void spaces might look like.
Yeah, unfortunately, I actually didn't, I wasn't able to finish the interior render for that area. So sort of the cross section is kind of one of our best shots. You can also see it if we look at the detail chunk. You can begin to see sort of the void being cut through on the left side over here, and get a sort of 3-dimensional concept of those programmatic spaces punching out into the void. But as you were saying, that was a very important part of the program to me, because the program was so dense. It was actually really tough to figure out ways to sort of give the programs the space they needed without also entirely isolating them from each other. And that's where the voids provided this really great opportunity for that.
One thing that I can't tell is inside of those voids, and maybe a longitudinal section through the void would show it as well. Something I'm trying to see if the interior elevation that's created in that void space has the legibility that the exterior envelope has, that you've been working to create a quite legible exterior massing. And I'm wondering if is that to be as legible on the interior, or are you blurring the programmatic differences? What is your intent?
So if we take a look at the interior, I think one of the things I wanted to bring from the outside was sort of this like idea of wrapping coming in, which is these white objects right here, which are actually not the community connectors, but help to sort of divide up the glazing on the inside. But I think that's actually a really good point that I didn't consider, is bringing the exterior facade on the inside and continuing to show that programmatic change through the interior atrium. I
think you did a good job in the exterior of modulating the different scales through, and then showing the programmatic relationships on the facade. And the interior seems more, I don't know, two-dimensional or something, in the sense that you are illustrating a relationship between glass facade and program shared spaces. And I think that the richness of the exterior programmatic form relationships could be better articulated on the inside. But overall, compliment you on the project. Very thoughtful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I agree.
So Daniel, this is Ingalill. I wanted to make a few comments as well. So congratulations. I think when Stephen describes a 660,000 square foot project, it's pretty ambitious. And I feel like you have a good grasp on each of the pieces. And I think the modular strategy that you described, I think is a very good one. And as Jeff is mentioning, there's a clarity and you begin to understand the pieces and how they come together when you see these overview shots. Mm-hmm. There were two pieces I was particularly interested in. One was your formal study that was early mm-hmm. on. And I thought that the clarity of that, I really liked that diagram. And I have to say I missed it a little bit because there's a whimsy to it or a clarity mm-hmm. That in missing, and I do think it's these internal spaces that get blurry. And in this diagram, the sort of figure-ground relationship, I think is clearer. Even if the interior spaces are less sort of atria, traditional atria, I think mm-hmm. that they make for more interesting architectural spaces. So I wonder if some of these ideas might find its way back into the project as you begin to skin those interior courtyard areas.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, actually. So that's sort of something, if I think self-critique is really important as you finish up a project and as you start producing things. And I agree, the void space did start to lose a little of that whimsical.
It gets a little mushy also, and I think here mm-hmm. there's a clarity to it that I really like. The other mm-hmm. piece is the connector piece, and I think that you could really amplify those, and I think you need to commit to them and understand mm-hmm. them. I feel like they don't have enough personality, and mm-hmm. I wonder if a material, a color, that there's some, they almost look like they could even be mobile. Maybe I've watched too much Harry Potter with my 11-year-old, but the idea that these pieces could actually begin to, that there's almost like a plug-in idea for it. I'm just throwing that out there, that there's a sort of, I think they could do more for you. And maybe, okay. Maybe I'm, kind of falling back on less architectural and more, sort of playful suggestions. But I think that architecturally and by doing that, it will give you a richer sort of programmatic blend, so what mm-hmm. happens when housing encounters restaurant, what happens when, so you could really use them as ways to test out programmatic overlap where there's a discomfort, but really heighten that, especially in today's sort of circumstances. Anyway, congratulations on the program, but it seems to me, or your project, it seems to me those are two areas that you could really amplify even further.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think your comment about the idea of sort of moving more towards architecture and less towards the playful design is a really good critique for the project.
So this is Jeannie. Hi, and similarly, I want to commend you on both the clarity of the presentation, but also I think, as Jeff mentioned, the legibility of the project overall. But if we can dwell on the slide that you stopped at a moment ago, these community connectors that
absolutely
we'll end it on. So I really liked this moment in your presentation because you were talking about this idea of the opportunity for these different communities to blend within the project, because it's a super complex program, giant, as was already mentioned, and different demographics and mm-hmm. kind of populations mixing. And so I liked the way that you described these spaces. And then I really began to imagine the interior life of the building. I don't know if in your precedent studies you guys looked at Ricardo Bofiel's Walden 7, but it almost reminded me of that, so there's that scale, and then there's the atrium scale, but I felt like maybe a kind of middle scale was somewhat missing, which starts to be implied by the formal studies that you began with, where as was just mentioned, where not just different types of housing mix, but different types of larger programmatic chunks might mix and produce something new. But then mm-hmm. as an extension of that, I think one area that maybe that could have started to percolate is actually on the overall massing. Like, is there a way for these things to get a little larger and start to create almost these urban rooms? I know you have them at the street level, but I don't know this site, but I was thinking in particular about the alley edge and the kind of proximity of the buildings behind it, and wondering whether something more of a kind of larger urban voiding strategy that punctures out of the facade might have been a way to start blending, as you were saying, program, but start blending edges between the project itself and some of the kind of things that it's aligning with on the site.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really fabulous point. I think being able to take that same strategy and apply it as an urban strategy, or even sort of an idea of bringing those voids down and out and then onto the site is a really great idea, and actually something I didn't consider as much as I was working through the project. So thank you for that feedback.
Hey, Daniel, this is Tom.
Hi, Tom.
I'd like to kind of echo the three previous comments. Congratulations on a great project. It's very articulate and a beautiful presentation. So thank you for the clarity of the drawings. And
thank you.
It's really nice to see the work. My comments I think are going to be very similarly in line with the previous, kind of relating to these open spaces. And I thought the comment by Ingalill about the kind of the transition from your earlier studies to this more modular system here, you're doing a great job of breaking the scale down, but I think you are kind of losing a little bit of this balance of kind of the sculptural qualities that you were taking advantage of in your previous study. And as it becomes more fragmented and nuanced, as you're mentioning, it'd be great to kind of work some of the larger gestures back into this as you're carving the spaces out. And then the next point I'd like to make is about your void spaces. So if you could go to this section.
The cross section or longitudinal?
This is perfect.
Okay.
So I think it's really great the way that you've activated the interior of this building. And I especially like the idea of this kind of elevated piano nobile, which could have a whole range of possibilities up on for this augmented piece of landscape up on an upper level. If you know this site at night, definitely not right now, but typically in normal circumstances on the weekend, there's a very busy intersection where the transition of all of these different kind of commercial and retail spaces are coming together, and this opportunity to draw the public up into these kind of other levels of public program in the building is a fantastic opportunity. I can't help but think that there's a little bit of a missed opportunity in terms of going down as well as up. I think right now you're using the ground plane kind of as zero, and below that is parking, and above is the project, but it could be a really fantastic complement to this kind of intricate space you've created. As if you're a pedestrian coming into the building, you're looking up and down at these juxtaposed programs. And with that, also, if you could go to the overall image, this is just purely a comment about the ground floor. I think that some of the intensity that you have in section is lost a little bit on the ground floor plan. And this is something where you have, and I understand that you're bringing a lot of retail in, but you're doing this really great move of creating these new public spaces, potentially up and down from the street level. And I think you have a great opportunity here where you can actually void out more of that ground floor space and bring more of the public up into your building. And right now, it's I think the commercial kind of retail storefronts that you have are not necessarily kind of strengthening the very powerful project you have. And that's a just very minimal kind of slight critique, but overall, great project. And thank you very much for the work.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. I think, yeah, if I do have a chance to respond, I think one of the things that I was sort of struggling and sort of playing with creating a building in an urban context is the idea of sort of holding a site boundary, just in terms of at night and safety when people are walking around. But your idea of actually opening it up to a very large space, because it's sort of small nooks and crannies that become dangerous. But by bringing those voids down and that concept down and creating a void space not only up but also down, I think that could actually be a really wonderful complement to the building. So thank you very much.
I think that was a really great review. Thank you for the commentary, everybody. Danny, you've worked extremely hard, so I really am impressed the whole time. You're very consistent too, always have been. And I agree, I think, with Ingallill's comment and the rest of the group as they followed that, you know, I've been pushing on you endlessly about how cool the starts are, that first project was, and the spaces. And you can see, I think it's not just Daniel, see most of our students have a struggle with that kind of interiority of the building having shape and being okay with that. And I'm not really sure what that is exactly, but I think you're pushing yourself really hard, and this project came very, very far. And I think, again, everyone's lots of clarity in the way in which you present this work, probably one of the most outstanding on that level. So thank you. And we're gonna move on to Reann. Are you there?
Great, thank you, Stephen.
Here we are.
I'm here,
Great, so you can start.
sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, give me one.
You know, I also want to just say before you get started, Teddy and Ismael and Pavel are out there, I think, in the group. So if they wanted to, at some point, want to say something, that, you know, please, you know, make your comment or something. You know, there they are. Like, we're hiding ourselves, so it's just the critics, so we can take the photos. But
Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
That's perfect. Thank you again for coming to speak with us today. My name is Reann, and my project is titled Cores on Main. And with this initial project, I found interest in central spaces or cores that act as collaborative areas for different programs and people. So with the study, or the study of the core, it was essentially just of a central space enclosed by a program as seen on the image on the left. I don't know if my cursor is pointing it out. But I found that through displacing and distorting that core, not only was I able to develop the relationship between different programs and helping that become more dynamic, but it also allows the core a sense of permeative movement, which is what I kind of set a goal towards, as seen on the image on the left, right? And this is my site plan and how the building sits on the site. And I wanted to allow different areas of the site to be open to kind of allow that permeative movement to kind of be embedded within the program and the building. And this is how I kind of laid out the building program for my project. So like what Stephen and Daniel had mentioned, we had to break down retail, commercial, office space, hotel space, and residential. And I wanted to delegate the ground floor to the public spaces so that all the, on the ground floor, so that all the other programs kind of interact with each other above. And kind of bringing in the idea of that collaborative core, I wanted to lay these programs out in a way where they were able to interact with one another in a kind of respectful and appropriate way, allowing kind of different spaces and the cores themselves to be flexible. So I just have this little like animation here showing that this like pool area up here can be used for different purposes by different groups of people, whether it be daycare as recreation or for training. And that's kind of the idea I wanted to implement throughout the building as well. And this study came from our initial form study. And you can see in the axon here on this page, I kind of wanted to play with how the punctures interconnect with one another through section, and also experimenting with fluidity and movement through this contextless object. And kind of that sense of play is what I was really into, and I wanted to bring that in. And I found that a lot of these punctures were interesting, but they didn't have any they didn't have any purpose or function. So I wanted to be able to implement that with the program that we were given. And then here, just my initial form studies, my dissimulation on top, and then once we started playing with the site, is kind of how I started developing my program with the cores embedded within it. And for, and these are the elevations I've produced. So I wanted to kind of find a balance between the monolithic quality of my building, but also allowing for that permeative movement to kind of be evident. So there's open space and the building is essentially split in two, but there's still a sense of connectedness that I wanted to implement and kind of make evident in the design. And, oh, sorry. And this is my ground floor plan. And so what I've done with these collaborative cores is I've used these voids to articulate the main entries into the building, whether it be into this kind of like food retail area or this like purely retail area, or from the outside in this kind of outdoor seating into that market. And essentially, similar to the concept diagram I had in the initial, in the beginning page, I wanted to utilize these central cores as a way to permeate through the spaces and use them as a way of circulation, along with kind of articulating the entries into different areas and kind of allowing that to be a shared space between all the retail spaces or between all the food spaces. And I kind of articulated that here as well, where despite them all being public areas, they do have different, or they can have different kind of sub-programs depending on who inhabits them. So that would be, I found that these would be interesting spaces to be able to kind of like integrate the different programs. And this is the housing floor plan. And so kind of evident in my axon, I wanted to be able to integrate the different types of housing and also public spaces, and allowing each to have their own like shared community space, and allowing those spaces to be flexible. So I also didn't want to kind of segregate different types of housing, whether it be micro units in this area and larger housing or mid to low income in a certain area. I wanted them to kind of coexist within that general space and be able to do so and have spaces allocated towards whatever their needs are. So the gradients that I've kind of articulated here are those shared spaces between the different types of housing and hotel spaces and different kind of like public spaces like a library and a reading nook over here. And so in my cross-section, I wanted to kind of articulate that atrium space, and it's still being developed, but I do want, my goal in having this atrium space is to have it be inhabited, not just simply as like a void space. So that's something I really want to kind of continue pursuing. And yeah.
So thank you for your presentation, Reann. This is Ingalill. I wanted to go back. You know, some of your early studies, you were very specific about certain programs. The fitness, what were the three? What one's fitness? Help me out here.
Sorry, let me go back. Is it?
One, okay. Yeah, here, daycare and classes, fitness and training, and recreation and leisure. And I feel like those would be very helpful. I mean, you think about how bodies occupy space, how bodies might come together in different configurations. And it seems to me that those could have played a much stronger role, because I think that the final outcome remains, you know, sort of generic. And I think that some of this, you know, even just this diagram and imagining how that might occupy the space might help you to design what you call the core to become more intentional. So you probably know this, but a core in architecture parlance is typically, you know, the elevator, the stair, it's a physical, you know, solid.
Yeah.
And you're using core to define these voids or to describe these voids. And I think the idea that a void is a core is an interesting one. But then in some of your later plans, you then put an object or the elevator conventionally in the middle of that space. And it seems to me that, you know, that's kind of violating, I think, a little bit of your idea of these spaces. So trying to put those two comments together, what I would say is I think, you know, respect the void, and then also try to think of how you might begin to think of voids in different ways. And, you know, Stephen Hull has his lungs. Tom Main has the, you know, the Cooper Union project, for example. Those are all voids that have really intentional functionality in thinking about how bodies then occupy that space. And that could then begin to define those cores or those voids in your space and begin to activate them and still stay true to your intentions. So those would be some of my comments.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Hi, Reann. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed seeing a lot of the drawings here. My comment overall is just related to the void space and the language that you're using overall for the project. Mm-hmm. And I found your project at times simple and at other times very rich and complex. And this image on the screen I find very interesting, as well as if you can go to the series of elevations.
Yeah.
And these studies as well. I really like kind of the combination of forms that are creating your compositions here in elevation and in section. And now when we go to one of the plans, so here, for example, it's funny, it's sometimes you're using the void purely as a subtraction, right? And I'm thinking of architects like Le Corbusier that love to subtract and to carve, versus an architect like Maybury, James Sterling, who loves to add and make additive pieces. And here you have an opportunity to kind of do both, subtract and add. And in this case, you're kind of purely subtracting. But as you're breaking up these plans, and looking at the program, it feels kind of like you've just taken this plan and applied program to it. But I'm wondering if some of those programs can start to take on certain characteristics of the subtraction or the additive. So if you go back to the your 3D view at the beginning there, I really like how here, for instance, on this corner we're looking at, you have this barrel that's coming through, right? That's a subtraction. And now you have also this additive piece that's kind of violating that barrel and the void below. And I'm wondering if you can start to use that more deliberately to create kind of intricacy in your spaces of both additive and negative pieces. And so when you're thinking about the core is a void, that's a great idea, but also as your elevator shafts, do they always just need to be something that's offset somewhere in the middle of the mass, or can they kind of express themselves as more additive, solid pieces that start to help develop your language to be both positive and negative subtractions on your mass overall? Overall, I really enjoyed the project, so thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Jeannie. If I could just pick up on that, I similarly really enjoyed the presentation. I loved the moment in the beginning where you start out with this diagram explaining the core, and it's a circle in the middle of the square, and then suddenly you show this crazy site plan and the sort of earlier models that you did. But I wanted to pick up on that point and the kind of double meaning of the word core, because I think that, like everyone else, you know, this moment where you're implying a kind of 24-hour occupation of these spaces, and then later on when you describe them almost as gradients, I like that characterization of what these kind of additive subtractive moments might be. But I wonder too, because of the way that you have distributed the program through the site, it means precisely that the conventional core, the elevators, and the hallways and the stairs become super important in terms of how people circulate to these spaces and then occupy them. So they're not just appendages to these spaces, but I feel like they're part of the performance of how these spaces get used. So I think that could have been not only a way to rethink their role and not just, I guess, place them in a perfunctory location, but also to think about how they produce this kind of social mix that you seem to want to have in the building.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I do need to think about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Reann, I'd like to echo the other comments that my colleagues have made about the relationship between form and program in your project. I think that's something worth studying. I think this is a longer term project that you've started, this relationship between solid mass, void carving out, relationship between orthogonal grids and, you know, curved walls. Are they always extrusions? Sometimes they're extruding vertically, sometimes horizontally. You have some of these diagonal or curving extrusions that are happening as well. So looking at those techniques, I think you have a beautiful hand, a beautiful eye for these moves. I think sculpturally, the building has a lot to offer. And I was grateful to have seen it at the midterm. And I had a few questions then, and I wasn't quite sure if they were answered now, and maybe you can answer them now. I didn't see it in the drawings, but you might be able to help me out.
Yes.
We talked a little bit about the facades, I remember, because I noted that you had a beautiful solid block that you were carving from and working from. And how did you work out that sense of facade and solidity versus the subtraction, you know, versus the voids? Do you differentiate the materiality of the voids from the facade? Is the roof differentiated from the elevations? Do we see the articulation of these differing program spaces, or is this all kind of glass curtain wall Pacific Design Center type thing? Like what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so with the few iterations that I did previously, I felt that I was unknowingly like really fighting the kind of monolithic quality of the building, just because I was applying, I was trying to apply like different wooden panels just to kind of lighten up the building in a sense, and trying to use different materials to articulate the different types of programs that are also articulated in the program diagram. But I felt like I wasn't able to do it in a cohesive way, at least the iterations I've attempted. And so I think even with my initial dissimulation model, what I viewed from that was that it was this kind of larger mass that was very opaque on the outside. On the inside were all these special spaces.
Could you flip back to that for a moment?
Yes.
Those are they're really beautiful, but they beg a lot of questions, right? About they're gorgeous.
Thank you.
So how do you get from there to a building though? If all of that is white solid stuff, like how do you get to the building that has the folks inside are getting light, right, in those programmed areas on the floor? So how does that work?
How are they able to get light?
What are the facades? What is the material of the building on the elevations? What is the material of inside of the voids? What is the material of the roof? And what are we looking at in your final design?
I haven't like solidified yet, but in terms of
unintended.
Yeah, exactly. But even for instance with the housing plan, even though it still does need to be developed quite a bit. I intended for these kind of carving out in areas where it allowed for housing or the different programs to be pushed to the perimeter of that space. So for instance, even wherever my cursor is, the different cores and kind of smaller cores adjacent to those push all these kind of housing units to the edge so that they are able to get sunlight. And in terms of kind of the more public spaces, I did envision those having like just a lot of glazing as well. It's just finding.
Yeah, it's a trick, right? Because I think that the housing units are probably folks would want a balcony, or they'd want some way to open up to the fresh air. Or they'd want something. That facade would be a different quality in some way than some of the larger commercial program spaces, or even maybe some of the shared spaces. And certainly the void spaces have their own qualities to them. And I would just think that as you develop the project, you would start to work this through in your drawing. You'd start to use wall thickness and line weight and start to differentiate what is more solid, what is more open, and that you would develop a language in that would enrich the overall party and the overall spatial organization and kind of formal logic of the project. So I would strongly encourage you to keep developing this project in that sense. You know, for your portfolio, if nothing else, but I think for your development, it would be really, really strong to see this through architecturally.
Yeah, I do really want to pursue this further.
Okay.
But thank you for all of that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I guess that's one of the funny experiences when you get to see someone at mid-review and final review and you're not 100% sure. There are many differences between the two. If she'd shown mid-review, I think you would see it was a very different project on some level.
Yeah, no, it's much better. I mean,
it's much better, I agree.
It's beautiful, yeah.
But then there's a lot of underdevelopment too in certain areas that you're just kind of hoping she would have gotten to. And I'm sure Reann, you'd probably feel the same way. But yeah, for me, I'm also very grateful that you didn't give up on, you know, the difficulty of the beautiful forms that you were creating, and that you tried to find a way to make them work in plan and section. And I think I agreed with everyone that some of the second diagram, like the first real diagram of your project was really hopeful. That one that showed, you can go back to it, it's very pretty.
Thanks.
That one, go back, go forward.
The Paraline view, the axon.
Yeah, the axo.
Okay, one more. There you go.
That one shows to me that you were starting to really hold on to the things that were complex and difficult, but also quite beautiful, which you have a hand for, but then also try to figure out how you might program those spaces. And I think, you know, Ingallill's comments with Jeannie's as well, that, you know, how you end up putting the elevators and things within those voids and what those voids become programmed, how you program the voids to be exciting, that could really help you. And then as you get into development of skin, that's also gonna help. So there's a lot of wonderful things that you're working on. And I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity for the last, you know, time to work with you on this. And I hope it maybe changed the way in which you pursue your next project. I do hope you get a little further on development aspects, because, you know, with the people like Pavel and Teddy and Fabio, I don't know if you got to structures, so, and wall section, but that would have added a new conversation, as, you know, Jeff was kind of adding in there, you know, getting to the skin also would then reinform how you might reevaluate and try to hold on to the beautiful masses. So hang in there, and I really appreciate it. Pavel, you want to say anything?
No, I mean, we didn't get the chance to develop this aspect of the project, but what I see here is very promising, and she has gone a long way. It's a really beautiful project. I can help her with the solution of the facade, and Fabio for sure with the structure. If if she has a problem the desire to continue with this project, please contact me. No matter that the semester is over, we still can figure it out. There are many solutions. I don't want to drop them right now in the jury.
Yeah.
It's a matter of discussion. But I admire the color palette which you're getting there, and it's very challenging in the terms of enclosing the space. And sometimes the project is good to stop in a certain point and to leave it for another time to develop it further. And the beauty of it is to be as abstract as it is right now. So I think it's a great, it's a really good project.
Thank
Great.
you.
So let's jump to Ivan.
So my name is Singh Parihar, and the name of my project is Contoured Craters. And primarily I was investigating relationships between different surfaces and their impacts through Porsches and diagrammatic strategies. This was my disk simulation exercise, which got me interested towards different surfaces, curvature, convexities, concavities, and their impacts sectionally and in plan formats. So the way I decided to go about this project was to analyze these geometries in a more systematic way so I could involve them with the program. I started off with a massing with cuts and features I liked from my dissimulation project. This allowed me to provide certain cuts and openings and influence my programmatic decision as to where I want to place what kind of program. The way I tried to go with the program was to have the residences on the top levels and the hotel kind of in the middle and the office storefronts kind of on the lower levels. To add the convexity and the concavity from my previous model, I started analyzing these masses in terms of overlaps, which would tell me places which might be able to host certain features in the form. To make these experiences more observable through the occupants of the building, I decided to add cores right through the points where there were potential openings in the geometry. There were certain parts of the project which were cantilevering and there were massive cutouts, so it features two kinds of structural system. Then I decided to find the position for certain kind of cuts in the massing, which would allow space and more light and interact with the facade of the building. Then I added certain morphs, so I could add a level of dynamism in the building, and these morphs are located towards the front side of the facade, so they are actually integrated with the envelope in some way. Then I did a texture study featuring how I can utilize these, I can read the geometry in a better way, and that every geometry has its own unique points. And this is a little animation about how I started thinking about the facade, how it can wrap around and kind of unify the entire building together, yet kind of having a unique touch to each face by adding certain kind of variations in the facade. And then I simplified this study into a more programmatic way by creating different kind of facades for different programmatic functions. Then I started working on the building envelope, which seals the entire structure by creating certain voids inside of the building. These are my sections, which are conceptual, but they express how different programs come together, and these sculptural voids are able to help to maintain certain needs for the program, such as privacy or visibility concerns. While traveling through the elevator on the course, occupants are able to observe different cutouts through the building. because the center part is the portion where all these geometries kind of come together and they create these opportunities for Booleans and subtractions. I tried to express similar thing in the floor plans as well, where you have an atrium which has a landscape feature next to it and social services on the top, while the residences are their own unique clusters. This is the first floor of the building, which allows people to come under the building, but not exactly inside of the building. So people can experience the facade by being closer to it, not just by like looking at it. And these are the renders. I was particularly interested in blending different facades and different programs together. So it creates its own unique language, which expresses the diversity in the program and the complexity present inside of the program. This is the front view of the building. I've been interested in screen systems where it could be used in places such as retails and office, so it could allow light inside. And the facade elements on the residential units have a potential of being balconies where people can actually come out because they extend quite a bit towards the street level. So it could be a possible opportunity for the occupants to have a better interaction with the site. This is the night render with the different programs. I was interested in these big cuts which separate the program in a way, so it could also help provide privacy needs between different units, as well provide sufficient lighting on the residential units. There are cutouts on the rooftop to promote lighting deep into the voids of the building. And this is the street view. Yep.
So I'll just jump in here, Ivan. I think you're working with some really powerful ideas here. But, you know, in all three projects now, I find really interesting this dissimulation exercise that each of you have done. Maybe you can go to that sketch model. And, you know, the question, because I think very quickly, each of you came onto a strategy. And then the question becomes, is that strategy work, you know, as you begin to architecturalize it, right? So what are the factors that then led you to change or make modifications in the design? And what I was missing a little bit, I did appreciate a lot of the efforts in terms of facade. You talked a lot about the facade. You talked about these cuts that separate programs, for example, as ways of a kind of an organizing strategy. But what I didn't hear, and I wonder if this could help you guide the project further, has to do with, you know, what does it mean to have a hotel room, and what is the formal language or the typology of, you know, say a multifamily or a housing project, different from, say, an assembly space, which is different from, so how would that then lead you to make decisions about, say, the cuts or the size of the cut, the amount of light coming through, the, you know, space between the pieces? And I wonder, because I think the sections are really, as I said, I think the sections are very powerful. and it makes me think that the plans should be equally powerful, and they're not. So in other words, I think the plan and the section, given that your cuts are sometimes horizontal and sometimes vertical, I think that a strategy to move towards is that the plans and the sections are very similar, because you're creating occupiable space using very similar planimetric and sectional strategies. And so as I look at the plan, I'm less enticed than I am by the section that gives clues in terms of ventilation and kind of tightness of space and all of those other factors at your control. So I'll just leave it there, but those are just a few of my comments. And I'm not sure you realize, but the concept board that was shared, there's a lot of notes on it.
Oh, that was my process board. I can reshare.
Okay. Yeah, no, it looked like, your critics' notes, but I actually appreciated it because you can then see the process of the feedback.
I'm sorry, was someone else about to say something after Ingalill, or Yvonne, did you want to respond?
Oh, it was definitely helpful, like analyzing, like breaking down the different kind of housing units into their own independent clusters and figuring out the fenestration purposes for that. Like that's a very helpful strategy to be used.
I just wanted to say that I was struck by some traditional architectural techniques that you integrated into your project that you didn't talk much about. So in a way, you created this plinth condition in the project. If you go to your section, it's with the dissimulation in the lower part of the section that has the curvilinear forms, the sculpted forms, sort of gives way to the more regularized floor plates above. And I mean, it has the appearance to me in some ways that it looks like if you look at Renaissance architecture or something where you have highly rusticated lower levels of a building and kind of more fine grain ordered upper levels. There's this strange historic quality to that, plus the obvious qualities of the Baroque. I even see elements of like Opera Garnier in the lower levels, the way you've worked out the circulation and that sort of thing. So I appreciate the sort of historic references that are embodied in aspects of the design. I think that part of it is strong. I think that this idea of diversity and complexity is what you said.
Yeah.
That you tried to articulate that. I appreciated the fact that you actually had a thesis or a point in terms of what the building was to express, that the building was to signify these things, and that you made an attempt to make it signify them. I appreciate the fact that you looked at so many different building systems and tried to integrate them. I think that was strong as well. I would say that as you go back to the program, as per the previous project that we looked at with Reann, I think there's questions about whether the program that you are working with is best suited to some of the spaces that you've created. I think that it's just worth thinking about how that program pushes back on some of the spaces. And I know it's very hard to take on such a massive project in such a short amount of time, especially as one person doing it and not a team of people. I get that. But there's an aspect of the design emerging through that push and pull between the program and its formal articulation. And sometimes it was as though, there were these scoops or cuts or these moves on the exterior elevation. And then there were, other elements that was, okay, this is the program here. I think there's got to be a second pass. Is the program appropriate for this form? Is this the right proportion for this type of program? Is this the right type of space? How would I modify the design of this space to meet the program? And I think one telling aspect of this is that we never saw really an interior image of this project in some of those spaces. There's a lot of focus on the exterior presentation of the project. And I think that other than the drawings, we haven't really experienced some of those spaces. So I would just advise you to go back, and if you have more time to work, to say, how could I begin to modify the program to relate to my goals for the expression of the project.
Hi, Ivan, this is Tom. I'd like to kind of follow up on those past two comments. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed some of the imagery. I would say that in certain aspects, the fine articulation and the kind of the intricacy that you're making in these complex spaces is very successful, and it's really helping to strengthen your project. But I think one place where your project could use a little bit of work is kind of backing out to the larger, more diagrammatic moves as a way to organize the project and to strengthen the more articulated moves that you're making at a finer grain. So I'm thinking about like this image here. I think you're doing a lot of this intuitively. There's a reference to the plinth that you were making before, and then these kind of three larger volumes. But I think that those ideas about kind of the larger organization of the building could use some work. So if you go to the floor plan 7, for example, yeah, here, where you have clearly two separate masses of kind of this piece off to the side and the back piece. Could you talk about that void a little bit? Kind of talk about what that is and why you have these kind of two separate masses.
So it's picked up from my disk simulation study where I had 3 cubes stacked on top of each other. So programmatically, the way I had programmed the building initially was in 3 major cubes, but then I started dissolving them at the plinth level. And as you go higher and higher, one of the cubes just separates off from the rest of the 2 cubes. In turn, it creates a completely isolated housing type versus an housing type which is surrounded by all sorts of programs. So I wanted to add like a complete variation in the housing typology. So that was the main reason I added a void. And the second reason was to promote sunlight into the units, because if you go up, it's all filled with residential. So a big void between 2 cubes kind of helps to fill in some sunlight to the lower floors.
That's great. And I think that bringing those types of diagrams in kind of at a more simplistic level will help you build an argument. The other thing that might be helpful as well are kind of larger diagrams that have to do with site contextualization as you're working with these forms, because I think I saw that there could be some pretty significant site relationships that you're making here with your cuts in relationship to the building across the street and the building directly adjacent further down 9th, I believe. Yeah, so I think your project could really just kind of benefit from an introduction of kind of more basic massing and site contextualization diagramming. But thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot. It was super helpful.
Hi, Yvonne. This is Jeannie. This maybe echoes much of what was said by the other panelists, but first I would start by picking up on that last point, because I think that somehow your project, more so than some of the others we have seen, seem to have this opportunity to actually enlist the ground plane a little bit more in some of the sectional moves that you are making, and really kind of imbricating the project into the site rather than having it just sit on it. And so I'm glad you stopped here, because I feel like it's a very ambitious project with a lot of ideas. And so I feel like some of what is being said in terms of zooming out and understanding the big picture is also about editing maybe some of the things that are creating some kind of hierarchy between the things that you want to emphasize. And so to me, this conceptual section is one point, and then the facade and the animation that you created, and clearly your enthusiasm for it. I think those are the 2 moments where the initial kind of charge of the project to address diversity and complexity, those are very present in those 2 images. And then I think some of the other things that you tried to place into the project, and the maybe, I don't want to say disappointment because it's not disappointing, but the fact that the plan doesn't have the same kind of compelling charge as this section does. I think part of it is the struggle of a project that is as large as it is, but maybe it's a question of editing some of the ideas that you had. And so one thing that I just want to bring up that might have been helpful to address some of the comments that have already been made. I think you made a reference at some point to an idea poché, which I think could have helped with the sort of the materiality and reconciling this beautiful image with how you then deal with the program that you've been given. And so I would just place emphasis on that as something that I think could have been one of the ideas that percolated to the top of the many ideas that you had for the project.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was definitely very helpful because it was a massive program and all the feedback just made up a more clear picture in my head about what I have to do next with my project. So I really appreciate the feedback.
Hey, Ivan. I've enjoyed working with you. You're very interesting in the way in which you've proceeded this whole time. I'm sure the other critics will think the same thought, but like the way in which you came up with those really cool models to begin with, but had a struggle in the making of the model, which is actually interesting. So you challenge yourself with these 3D skills, but then put yourself into a very impossible task ahead, and then kind of went with it anyway. I find one that you kind of came a huge distance in terms of trying to figure stuff out, and that section still is my favorite. Just go to the building section because it makes me happy. I think it makes everybody happy. It has the most potential. But what I find that maybe will help you further is I think you do interesting cinematographic techniques, like a cinematographer, that kind of hides some of your challenges. Kind of like if you think of movies these days, they always make them, they use lighting in a very tricky way to avoid actually having to make things, right? So I think you did a lot of interesting rendering techniques and a lot of modeling techniques that keep you from ever having to draw. And I think they caught you on the plan. And, there is a 3D model that exists behind this thing that probably actually has a lot of information that may or may not match the plan itself and may not work for every plan that you may proceed or that you're kind of working on. That kind of comes across in the section. But I think if you drew more and drew more hardline drawings and weren't afraid to draw in that format, I think you would, and also we've been talking a lot about diagrams too, and diagram and then draw some more. I think you would find you could start to really work out some of these ideas that you're having so you can edit out the next to impossible spaces, which I know you did on the section. Once you actually cut the section from your model, you realize half those spaces were impossible, but then you edited them. And in editing that, then you could come back to the 3D model and fix it, which I'm not 100% sure ever happened. But I think that as a technique might help you because I think you're coming along a far way. I think maybe less ambition might also help you too. Like in terms of the formalism, you can simplify a lot. And I think what we're noticing with this interesting, I think you're the only one like this, you created a really interesting ground for the office. And then you've got the housing above it. And one has like a concrete structure that allows a different type of structure than the one above that's maybe more metal and steel and has a different sort of purpose. I think you did some really interesting things with that, and it's very helpful, in my opinion. And I think it's super cool. It's just, again, it's like just maybe a little editing along that journey to make it more clear to yourself as you work on things. I think you came in an enormous way. So I really, really impressed. So thank you. And thank you, critics, for helping him and working with us. We have one more project. Inno?
So thank you all for taking the time to review some of our work. We're all very appreciative of your guys' time. This project of mine that I call An Urban Within is driven primarily by speculations on a mixed-use multi-housing project that aims to replicate certain qualities of an urban life concentrated within a city block. Our given site is located on Main Street in between 8th and 9th. The primary site entry point is on Main Street as it allows for the most street frontage for the given site. The project takes inspiration from different zoning relationships that are present in an urban and suburban scale and translates it into a vertical format. Much like how a city transitions from zones and districts as you radiate outward from the center, the project separates into 4 towers that are representative of different neighborhoods. The program was particularly interesting because of the wide range of program types and their varying necessities. Some program requires more of a public presence, while others require more of a private one. The building is separated into different zones that allow for the street frontage to meet the requirement of the program and services. Although integrated in some regard, the creative and retail, hotel, and housing are separated externally and occupy different portions of the site, as you can see here. You can see here that the office is separated from the hotel and housing zone, but is integrated internally through the use of retail. On the ground floor, we see more of the independence of these program types having separate needs and requirements, with the hotel occupying a wider range of services, such as a drop-off for valet and a grander reception space. On the second floor, a separate raised entrance away from the street allows some privacy for the housing program. Here you can see that the housing units are focused internally and are positioned around a courtyard. On this particular floor as well, due to the nature of limited space allotted for the lower income housing, it was important to find a way to build community. So by providing the rooms with only necessities such as a kitchen, bathroom, and a small bedroom, more space was given to like a shared lounge and more resources like a shared laundry. On the right side, you can see that there's some more floor plans that are more diagrammatic. So these floors translate the radiating zoning format of a city vertically. And so as you go higher, the building de-densifies and gives more open air space and there's less building. Much like how you move from an urban scale to a suburban scale. In this section, we see the relationship of the towers to a void space that is specific to each tower. In this particular one, the creative office receives a light well that is formed from a similar geometry as the overall tower massing. This light well is internal to the massing, but is an external condition connected through punched openings on the side of the building. In this next section, you see the relationship of the towers to voids in the form of courtyards. These outdoor conditions cater to the individual towers and create a sense of rhythm. So there's 4 main towers and each tower has its specific void that caters to its needs. Moving on to the articulation of the external character of the architecture, one of the goals I had in mind was to blur the corner conditions of the geometry through the use of a projected pattern on the facade. The facade is primarily composed of these aluminum fins that wrap around the corner and creates a visual continuity that allows for a perceived flatness when viewed horizontally. And before I end, I wanted to quickly run through the inspiration for the language that was developed. So this was a design study that we had earlier on. And the goal for this was to use analogous geometries to create space within a space and figure out a way to undermine the monolithic nature of a solid geometry through the subdivision and patterning. You can also see here an early inspiration of the interior relationships of void spaces. So they are internal to the geometry, but are external conditions. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time. And I can go to any slide you'd like to see.
So I do have a question. You call your project Urban Within. Can you just give me a 2-sentence summary of what that means, what you mean by that?
I was trying to create, or it was an attempt to have an internally focused programmatic organization. So providing interrelations within different programs that are I guess different infrastructures, much like you have like a business district and you can also live within the building because they're separated through retail, but still connected because there's essentially within the same compound.
So congratulations. I think your project is incredibly thorough, thoughtful, well conceived, beautifully drawn, delineated. So it's a pleasure to see it. It's curious that you ended with your studies because I see a direct lineage of some of the things you were studying there, and you know, and then being articulated into clearly occupiable spaces that I think have character. And I also really appreciate when you talk about community, and that's what I was kind of trying to lead you to, because I do think you've created multiple communities in this project. And I would say the one area that I think you could amplify maybe for your portfolio is these communities. In other words, to try to, and it's not going to be a tower and a tower and a tower, but that there's a overlap between uses, and where you can imagine somebody who lives there this is their sphere, and this is where, you know, this is their neighborhood within this complex, and somebody else has an entirely different neighborhood. And I think what that'll do for you, number one, I think you can then begin to delineate or draw these perspectival views to show that how different they are. Because if there was a criticism I would have, is that the way that you've represented it, there's a sameness in terms of scale, level, you know, width of tower. And I think that there's more to it than you're showing, for example, in the section. And I think the delineation or the articulation of the communities and the neighborhoods would help you to define those and to give them different character. So, but again, congratulations. I think it's a really, really beautiful project.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would just briefly echo that. I mean, there's just such a nice narrative that runs from your early studies to the resolution of the overall project that it was very, it was a pleasure to see it unravel, even if you ended with the beginning. And so I think I similarly had an appreciation for your attention to this idea of neighborhood and identity within the kind of mix of housing types and the populations that you are addressing. And I thought that the plan that you had of the low income housing, where you were describing the kind of pushing of amenities and communal spaces in order to create a sense of community within that cluster, I think was really sensitively resolved. But I thought that maybe, and this is where there are two like minor quibbles, two things that I see or read into the early studies that I lose a bit in the final project. One is the idea that these kind of lined orange spaces that might be about the moments where within a single community or a single neighborhood a sense of community is forged. There will be moments, I think, where populations might deliberately mix, which is sort of what's implied by that model. And then it brings up the question of access and how people get to these spaces and how these things are not always separate, but might sometimes be connected. And then, and again, it's only because everything else is so well resolved that I can, I guess, posit a question like that. But the other thing is that there's a certain lightness to the earlier studies where it's implied that you might begin to see this kind of lining of orange interior space, which I'm reading as the kind of communal space or the urban within the project from the exterior, whereas I think it reads a little more heavy-handed in the final resolution of the facade with these, I think you said they're aluminum fins, because suddenly it seems more binary, whereas there seems to be a kind of ambiguity and layering of space that's suggested by the earlier studies. But those are minor points. Like, I think overall the project was very sophisticated and it was really nice to hear you present it.
Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on that last comment about skin. In general, the beautiful presentation. It was very nice to see the work. It's very thorough, very clear presentation. And I was kind of left with, okay, where do you go from here, and what's the next thing to push this project forward? And I think one area could be, as you kind of ended with the skin study and then your conceptual studies about the space, and you made a reference of a space within a space. And it left me thinking that the concept of the liner, which you're highlighting in orange, and the wrapper is the kind of the gray element, is a little bit flat right now. Is there a way to add depth to those pieces where the orange doesn't necessarily always need to be so one-to-one with the wall, but can peel out and become a piece within the space, and you can occupy the line? The same with the facade. So rather than it just being a thin aluminum facade that's applied to the wall beyond, is there a way to start to introduce thickness and depth in these skin assemblies that you're creating as a way to add even more depth and intricacy to the spaces that you're making? So that's, again, a minor comment, but a potential thing to look at in the future. And great work. It's a beautiful project.
Yeah, I think the flatness of the facade was also something that towards the end I was having concerns with, and I was definitely considering creating an in-between layer for the assembly, having like a catwalk or some sort of balcony space in between the facade and the liner that you were saying, the orange kind of inlays. That's definitely something that I'm gonna try and look into.
Inno, would you be so kind as to flip back to slide 11? Yeah. I just, to comment on, some of the comments that have been made earlier, and I appreciate, Tom, your comment about the facade. I think that the project, to me, one of the things that's really striking about it is that it's very, the constructability of the project, the articulation of the parts. I really appreciate that about the project. And I think the way you've articulated these social spaces and the shared spaces and the orange, I really, think about almost a modular construction in this way, that you could actually begin to utilize something like that, and then begin to design what is site built, and then all of the screening and the facade system as well. I do think that the flatness of this facade is a little bit of a liability. I also think that the idea that does the screen ever go over the orange areas, or does the orange areas it always exposed? Never has screening in front of it.
In some areas it has like a mesh, but like in this one, and there's one in the back in the corner where when it's mostly housing related, I put a screen just because if there are kids playing or whatever kind of things are flying around, I didn't want to. It gives a sense of privacy, but also kind of like security, I guess.
Yeah, I think that the one, the clarity of the drawings is, I think in some way is the project could even be further enriched to think that the orange zones are embedded within the project or within the interior of the project. Right now, they have the same characteristic. They're always embedded in the facade. They stick out the same amount. They're kind of in there in a certain relationship with the skin all of the time. But, you know, what if these were hidden behind the screen? What if we saw the screen in the facade and we saw the orange areas recessed behind, and maybe there's an open area or an open air area with the screening, but then there's a shared community or amenity space further within the building, and we see that lodged, and we begin to read a depth of field in the project, which I think, you know, per the comments, I think you know, Jeannie was talking to as well, some of these spaces here. And I think the courtyard as well, I really liked how thoughtful the courtyard was and how carefully articulated some of those spaces were, the scale of the spaces in there. I wonder if, given the density of the project and the scale, if some of those need to be larger. I'm not sure. It almost begins to feel in this, let's see if I can mark the location on here, but kind of in these spaces, also some of the exterior spaces and the roof areas, almost like a cruise ship or something, where you have this deck where you're very kind of compact with this other housing and building around. I'd be very excited to explore some of those interstitial spaces more and think about the scale of them and how they're working. I think it's very exciting. And just one more comment about the kind of, the project almost has a new urbanist quality to it with the small towers within there. So you've broken this into these smaller projects, like smaller towers. And I think it actually works in this sense. I think there's something from an urban, I think there's something that you should question there and think about that articulation. So I generally really applaud the project and appreciate Ingalill and Jeannie and Tom comments on this. So it's really very good.
Thank you. Just, I guess the issue with the towers and the courtyards, I think my struggle was with the width of the site. I was having issues with having enough courtyard and enough building on the side to be, I guess, habitable with this kind of space that I was thinking of, but I definitely agree that there needs to be some more exploration in that.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, it's a horrible kind of precedent right now in the coronavirus pandemic, but if you look at the deck of a cruise ship, you know, there is something to that about how those masses are fit together in such a tight area and how they're separated and small courtyard spaces are created within. There's a lot of examples of this, but I think as a deck kind of layout like that with masses within, you know, it could be a good precedent for you, you know, not really formally like that, but I mean, just the allocation of space within this compact area with other taller masses that you're not accessing surrounding you. It could be a good thing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just going to comment, like, I wouldn't use the word new urbanism to describe his towers, but that's just my baggage, I suppose, historically speaking.
Well, they would go down to, I think if they were new urbanists, they would actually go down to the ground. That's the difference. You wouldn't have a
They might put white picket fences around it too. And
well, I would say that Gary's work, you know, a lot of, if you know, look at Edgemar or whatnot, and you've got this, you know, that is out of that same language, the same breakdown of scale of the block to create those interstitial courtyard spaces. So I think
I wouldn't put it new urbanist either. So yeah, I guess we have a different definition of that community of people. I would go to like Playa Vista and say that's more.
Yeah. No, I'm not reading any of the formal. I'm reading only the massing, only from a massing. There's not. To me, it's a very, let's say it's a positive.
Yeah, I agree with you. The positivity of this. I mean, you know, we have all these. You only get to see 4 projects. There's 30 of them. So they're all very different in the way in which they approach urbanity, the difficult program, Jeannie's last comment earlier about the social spaces and how those can actually become interesting mixers, how that can all happen. And I think you did a lot, you know, You covered a lot of ground, and I think you're probably the only one I think has these forward powers in the urban field. And I think it was a really interesting strategy that opens up the courtyard and the groundscape, or, you know, as you said, the deck on top of the ocean liner, and then you have all the upper spaces of the towers that allow light, because that's really one of the complexities of this problem. How do you get the light in? Do you stick voids in the middle, or do you, in this case, make a series of towers? So I think it was a really thoughtful project. Everyone's very clear in their assessments of that. And so I really like the way the critics worked through it and understood some of the problems still today. I mean, again, I think those first studies are still available to you to be mined. They have some really interesting internal, external spaces that maybe didn't quite find their way into your project yet, but had been there even sometimes in the urban massing. So I do applaud you for hanging in there and working so thoroughly on this design, and really kind of, I think maybe some of the ways in which you render in the gray mute some of the ways in which we can see the beauty of what you're up to. So that might be just some comment. It has to do with sort of the way the shadow lines, the way it's just hard to read. I don't know, Izzy, I see you there. You wanted to chat a little bit then.
No, I think all the projects were really strong. But I guess my only suggestion for maybe putting it in your portfolio is I always was curious about the interiority and just taking interior shots of all these voids and all these common spaces, and then experiencing as a human in the city coming into these projects. I think that is probably the most valuable thing. Is not about the form from the exterior, but the form as the human walks through the space. So I think, you know, there's time to do that perhaps next week or something.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, that added comment about the space between the screen and almost the corporate edge of the glass, that you yourself know has some trouble. I do think that's a space that needs to be pushed. Shows up mostly in the orange sections where it's very clear that it hasn't been pushed enough. Anyway, any last comments from the reviewers?
Just one thing, I kind of picking up on that last comment from Stephen about the kind of the muting of the reading with your use of gray here. It made me think, I think this is a comment that may apply to all of the projects, these kind of fantastic exterior urban public spaces, but no indication of landscaping. And that's something that downtown could really benefit from, especially in this area. I live just a block away from here and was always looking for a place to go downtown, to go to a park. And your project is just ripe with opportunity here. I think if you started to think about some of these orange spaces as being kind of more gardens, or, you know, sunken trees in some of them. So as you come up to this, the deck or the cruise ship, as we're calling it, on top, if that was a landscape space, it could really be just a fantastic amenity for the building, but also for the community in the fashion district there. So something to think about.
So I wanted to add a comment. I absolutely agree. I even thought that, yeah, exactly the same, that landscape would have been, or some green areas in here would have been really amazing. You know, I really appreciate the ambition of this project. You know, I already commented on the sheer scale of it. And I think the advice to students when you're working on a project like this is to pick a piece of it and just try to develop that, because that'll help bring it back around and make sure that, you know, you identify the idea that's most, you know, impactful, or that is most near and dear to your heart, and then articulate that. And that can then help you as you go back to finish up the boards and give you something for us to clue in on. And, you know, it means really articulated section, building section with skin, material, you know, even furnishing, you know, all of that would then really give us a sense of the type of space that you're imagining for your building. But super impressive that you're able to come so far with such a size project. So kudos to all of you, critics and students alike.
Yeah, very much. No, I would just say I really agree with that, Ingalill. And I would say just to Stephen, overall, I am really complimentary of the way this project is worked out, that I've gotten to see it from the dissimulation through this immense programmatic study to what this becomes as a building and the way it participates in the city and the way that it creates these social spaces. And I think for me, something that I'm quite interested in with my own students working on housing quite a bit is this figuration of these spaces, these the interface between the public and the interiority of the project, and how you're able to articulate that. And I will compliment the students for taking that on. I think now you have a double whammy. You have the, COVID and this pandemic, and this idea of how do we deal with common spaces? How do we deal with social spaces in the future? What is their future? Is it the same future? Is it altered or different in some way? And then, we have, what's happening now and happening today in Black Lives Matter. We have issue of folks who feel that they don't have the same access to public space as other folks feel. They don't feel they have the same visibility and voice in public spaces. And that degree of public to private space, how we articulate that, I think is essential. And I think that's up to you and your classmates, colleagues, to figure out what these spaces look like so that they become, inclusive and become, not only symbolic of inclusivity, but that they work as inclusive spaces, that they work as spaces that relate private ownership to public civic life. And my charge to all of you would be to keep pushing in that way, because it's really important.
Are we good then?
I have a question, Stephen,
Yeah,
if it's okay.
go for it.
So,
I can actually say that last year was twice as big of a program.
Was that the Google campus?
Yeah, that was way too big. Anyway, yeah, Jeannie.
No, I mean, I wanted to similarly say that I never would have assigned a program this large, and now you're telling me you had one that was twice as large, but to students. But I think the way the studio was structured with these, I think the dissimulation exercise at the beginning, but also positing it so that it was already calling into question the binary oppositions that we sometimes take for granted when tackling a design problem. It allowed everyone that I saw this afternoon to tackle, as you said, the project at an urban scale, but also at the scale of the program that you assigned. But my question is simple. I'm just wondering where the name of the studio comes from. Like
What is the name of our studio?
It's Flatlanders, so I know the reference.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a book, isn't it?
Flatland is a book by Edwin Abbott, but I was just trying to figure out what.
Well, it's because the years before we did, so we took that same double program and we made a series of high rises that were 70 stories high. It actually is an easier program because the footprint is so small that, and the core is so specific that it really does dictate a way of organizing space that is a much easier project than when you go to an urbanistic project that really takes a massive landscape that has to be managed as well, which I don't think we're as strong at understanding urban organization and larger campus type planning. I don't think is part of our expertise yet, and we're working on that. So Flatlanders is, I think, related to the idea of, one, maybe related to that, but also how in Los Angeles we are a horizontal skyscraper type community, and we take over massive landscapes of space, and yet we try to design within that these open spaces and life spaces and how it interacts with the city. So that's kind of what that title was. I'm surprised you found that. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. And it was lovely seeing everybody.
It's really
Thank you, everybody. It was great seeing you guys.